It began not with a public announcement but with a locked room, a sealed document, and a name no one expected to hear again: Diana. Inside Buckingham Palace, King Charles III's legal team uncovered something buried for decades, untouched, unclaimed, and dangerously powerful. And as whispers spread through palace corridors, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a disruption that could shake the very balance of royal power. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What began as a routine internal audit, one of those quiet, procedural reviews that rarely attract attention, quickly transformed into something far more unsettling. Reports suggest that Charles's legal advisors had been combing through layers of historical royal holdings, revisiting documents long considered dormant, questioning classifications that had never been challenged, and tracing ownership lines that blurred the boundary between personal legacy and institutional control. It was meant to be methodical, almost invisible work. But then came the moment that shifted everything. Hidden within a set of sealed records documents that had not been opened since the late 1990s was a reference that stopped the process cold. A private vault, registered under the name of Diana, Princess of Wales. Its contents officially listed yet never fully disclosed, its access neither revoked nor reassigned. For years, it had existed in silence, untouched, almost as if it had been deliberately left behind, waiting. Insiders whisper that even those conducting the audit were unaware of its full significance until the final layer of authorization was granted, triggering a legal review that few had anticipated. And what made it more unsettling was not just its existence, but its condition. There was no record of entry, no indication it had ever been opened since Diana's passing. It was, in every sense, frozen in time. That realization alone was enough to send a ripple through the palace's inner structure, because it raised a question no one could easily answer. Why had something so significant been left undisturbed for so long? The secrecy tightened almost immediately. Only a handful of senior figures were informed, and even among them, details were carefully controlled. Conversations became shorter, more guarded. Meetings were held behind closed doors, without formal scheduling. According to various interpretations circulating within royal administrative circles, the discovery was treated less like a historical footnote and more like a potential fault line, something that, if mishandled, could fracture carefully maintained balances. And then, as these whispers began to move quietly, cautiously through the inner corridors, the atmosphere began to change. Subtle at first. A shift in tone. A pause before certain names were spoken. Because the implications were becoming harder to ignore. This wasn't just about what had been found, it was about what it could mean now. And perhaps most striking of all was the reaction it seemed to provoke in Queen Camilla. Reports suggest she had not been informed in advance. That the revelation reached her not as part of a controlled briefing, but as a ripple, an unexpected piece of information arriving already weighted with consequence. Those familiar with the dynamics of the palace suggest that this alone created tension, not outwardly visible, but unmistakable to those who knew where to look. Because in a system built on awareness, on timing, on careful positioning, being caught off guard is never a small matter. It signals something deeper, something shifting beneath the surface. And as the realization settled in that a part of Diana's legacy had remained untouched, unaccounted for, and now suddenly rediscovered, the sense of unease grew stronger. Not because of what was known, but because of what wasn't. Because if something this significant could remain hidden for decades, what else had been waiting? And more importantly, why was it being uncovered now? At a moment when the monarchy was already navigating uncertainty, vulnerability, and quiet internal recalibration. The answers did not come immediately. They rarely do in situations like this. Instead, what emerged was a slow, tightening awareness, a recognition that this was not an isolated event, but part of a much larger unfolding narrative. One that connected past decisions with present consequences. One that blurred the line between memory and power. One that carried emotional weight as much as legal complexity. And as those within the palace began to piece together what this discovery might mean, one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. The vault was not just a relic of the past. It was something active, something relevant, something that had the potential to influence decisions, relationships, and perceptions in ways that had not yet fully been understood. And that is precisely why the tension continued to build, not in dramatic confrontations or public statements, but in quiet calculations, in cautious conversations, in the unspoken understanding that something significant had just entered the equation, something that could not be undone and could not be ignored. Because in the world of the monarchy, where history is never truly past and legacy is always present, even the smallest rediscovery can carry enormous weight. And this was far from small. This was something else entirely, something deeper, something that reached into the very core of what the institution represents, and how it chooses to remember, to preserve, and to protect. But what lay inside that vault wasn't just history, it was leverage, and its existence raised questions the palace had spent decades avoiding. Hidden beneath layers of protocol and silence, the vault wasn't just a storage space, it was a time capsule of unfinished legacy. What had initially appeared to be a dormant legal artifact, an overlooked entry in decades-old documentation, was now being re-examined with a level of urgency that suggested something far more consequential was at stake. According to reports circulating within administrative circles, the origins of this vault trace back to the immediate aftermath of Diana, Princess of Wales's passing, when extraordinary measures were quietly put in place to separate her personal estate from the broader institutional framework of the monarchy. It is said that legal protections were carefully constructed to ensure that certain items, those deemed deeply personal, potentially sensitive, or symbolically powerful, would remain beyond the reach of routine royal processes. At the time, those decisions may have seemed procedural, even protective. But now, viewed through the lens of the present, they carry a different weight entirely. Because what was once sealed for privacy has now become a focal point of scrutiny. Insiders whisper that the vault may contain a collection unlike any other, letters never publicly acknowledged, pieces of jewelry tied not just to wealth but to meaning, personal records that reflect a version of Diana the world was never allowed to fully see, and most intriguingly, sealed instructions whose purpose has yet to be fully understood. Each possibility adds another layer of tension, another reason for concern, another question that cannot easily be answered. And as these possibilities are quietly explored, the issue becomes less about the physical contents and more about the legal and symbolic implications they carry. Because there is no clear consensus on where this vault truly belongs. Some interpretations suggest it falls under private inheritance law, meaning its contents are governed by personal directives and familial rights. Others argue that its connection to a former Princess of Wales places it within the broader context of crown oversight, where institutional authority may assert influence. This ambiguity is not just technical, it is deeply consequential. It creates a space where interpretation becomes power, where legal nuance can shape outcomes, and where decisions made behind closed doors can ripple outward in ways that are impossible to fully contain. What complicates matters further is the historical context. For years, there appears to have been a deliberate effort to keep Diana's private affairs distinct from the machinery of the monarchy. Reports suggest that this separation was not accidental but intentional, a recognition that her legacy carried a different kind of significance, one that could not be easily absorbed into the institution without altering it. That boundary, once respected, now seems to be dissolving under the pressure of rediscovery, and with it comes a growing sense of unease. Because if the vault was designed to remain untouched, then its reopening, whether triggered by legal necessity, administrative oversight, or something else entirely, raises a critical question. Why now? Some sources suggest that specific legal conditions may have needed to be met before access could be granted, conditions that have only recently been fulfilled. Others point to the broader context, the current state of the monarchy, the shifting dynamics within its inner circle, the quiet recalibrations taking place behind the scenes as factors that may have accelerated the process. Whatever the reason, the timing has not gone unnoticed. Within palace administration, there is said to be a growing awareness that this discovery is not isolated. It intersects with ongoing conversations about legacy, authority, and the future direction of the institution. And as more attention is drawn to the vault, the sense of control that once defined its existence begins to weaken. Because the more that is uncovered, the harder it becomes to contain the narrative. The harder it becomes to decide who has the right to interpret it, to manage it, ultimately claim it. And that is where the tension deepens, not in what is known, but in what is still uncertain. Because uncertainty invites speculation, and speculation invites pressure. Pressure from within, from those who understand the stakes. And from outside, from those who are beginning to sense that something long hidden is finally beginning to surface. The vault, once silent, is now at the center of a quiet storm. Not because it speaks loudly, but because it doesn't need to. Its very existence is enough to shift perspectives, to challenge assumptions, to reopen conversations that were never meant to be revisited. And as those conversations continue to unfold carefully, cautiously, but with growing intensity, it becomes increasingly clear that this is not just a matter of history being rediscovered. It is a matter of history reasserting itself, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding to be understood, and perhaps most importantly, demanding to be resolved. But resolution is never simple in a system built on tradition where every decision carries weight and every action is measured against legacy. Which is why the atmosphere remains tense, controlled on the surface but quietly unraveling beneath. Because everyone involved understands what is at risk. Not just reputations, not just relationships, but the delicate balance between past and present, between personal memory and institutional authority. And as that balance begins to shift, even slightly, it sets in motion a chain of consequences that cannot easily be reversed. Because once something buried begins to rise, it rarely stops halfway. It continues, gathering momentum, drawing attention, forcing acknowledgement. And that is exactly what is happening now. The vault is no longer just a hidden space, it is a catalyst. A trigger, a point of convergence where legacy, law, and emotion collide. And as its contents begin to surface, it becomes clear this wasn't just about what Diana left behind, but who she left it for. For years, Diana's legacy was defined by what the world could see, but now, it was what she chose to hide that mattered most. What had once been remembered through public gestures, carefully curated narratives, and moments preserved in history now began to shift towards something quieter, more deliberate, and far more unsettling. Because as the implications of the vault deepened, reports began to surface suggesting that Diana, Princess of Wales, may have anticipated far more than anyone had previously believed. Not just personal struggles, not just emotional distance, but structural tensions within the monarchy itself, tensions that would take years to fully emerge. And if those reports hold even a fragment of truth, then the contents of that vault are not random remnants of a life cut short. They are intentional, thought out, placed there with purpose. Insiders whisper that among the items potentially sealed within are handwritten letters, private, unfiltered reflections that were never meant for public eyes, possibly addressed to her sons, Prince William, Prince of Wales, and Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. Letters that may carry not just emotion, but direction. Not just memory, but meaning. And if such documents exist, their significance goes beyond sentiment. They become guidance. They become influence. They become, in a way, a voice that refuses to fade. That possibility alone has begun to weigh heavily on those within the palace who understand the delicate balance between past and present. Because this is not just about rediscovering what Diana left behind, it is about confronting what she may have intended to say when she no longer could. And the timing of that resurfacing could not be more complex. The monarchy, already navigating a period of uncertainty and quiet recalibration, now finds itself facing a legacy that does not fit neatly into its existing framework. One that cannot be easily managed, reinterpreted, or absorbed. Because Diana's influence has always existed slightly outside the institution, close enough to shape it, but distant enough to challenge it. And now, that influence appears to be re-emerging in a form that is both deeply personal and structurally significant. Some interpretations suggest that certain items within the vault were intentionally withheld from any form of royal redistribution. Not out of neglect, but out of design. A decision to preserve them in isolation, untouched by the mechanisms that typically govern royal assets. If true, that decision speaks volumes. It suggests a desire to protect something from being diluted, from being repurposed, from being controlled. And in doing so, it creates a direct tension between personal legacy and institutional authority. Because the monarchy operates on continuity, on the seamless integration of past into present. But this stands apart. This resists integration. This demands its own space, its own interpretation. And that is where the divide begins to sharpen. Within palace circles, there are those who view this moment as an opportunity for reflection, a chance to revisit Diana's legacy with honesty, to acknowledge its complexity, to allow it to exist without reshaping it to fit a narrative. But there are others who see it differently, as a disruption, as a risk, as something that could reopen old fractures and create new ones. Because once private intentions become part of a broader conversation, they cannot be contained. They begin to influence perception. They begin to shift alignment. They begin to raise questions that do not have easy answers. And those questions, once asked, tend to linger. They echo through decisions, through relationships, through the very structure of how the monarchy presents itself to the world. That is why the atmosphere within the palace has grown increasingly divided, not in open disagreement, but in quiet uncertainty, in differing interpretations, in subtle shifts in tone and approach. Because everyone understands what is at stake, even if they do not agree on how to respond. And as that divide continues to widen, the emotional weight of Diana's legacy becomes impossible to ignore. It is no longer just a memory. It is a presence, one that carries with it unresolved questions, unspoken intentions, and a sense of unfinished narrative. A narrative that is now beginning to unfold in real time, intersecting with current realities in ways that are both powerful and unpredictable. And as that unfolding continues, it becomes increasingly clear that this moment is not just about the past being remembered. It is about the past asserting itself, demanding attention, demanding interpretation, demanding a place within a system that was never fully prepared to accommodate it. But while some saw this as a moment of reflection, others saw it as a threat, and no one felt that pressure more than Camilla. The moment the truth reached her, everything shifted, and the silence that followed spoke louder than any statement. There was no announcement, no carefully prepared response, no immediate attempt to control the narrative. And that, perhaps, was the most telling detail of all. Because in a system where timing is everything and awareness is power, reports suggesting that Queen Camilla was not informed in advance introduced a subtle but unmistakable fracture in the usual flow of information. It was not the discovery itself that carried the greatest weight in that moment. The way it arrived, quietly, indirectly, already carrying implications that could not be easily dismissed. Insiders whisper that the realization did not come as a formal briefing but as a ripple, a shift in tone among those who knew, a pause in conversations that had previously moved with certainty. And within that pause, something deeper began to surface. Because the re-emergence of Diana, Princess of Wales, not as memory, not as symbol, but as an active, unresolved presence, brought with it a complex mix of emotion and consequence. For years, the monarchy had carefully navigated that legacy, shaping it, honoring it, and at times, distancing itself from its more unpredictable edges. But now, with the discovery of the vault and the growing speculation surrounding its contents, that balance appeared to be shifting. And for Camilla, that shift was not abstract. It was immediate, personal. Because within the structure of the monarchy, legacy is not just about the past, it defines the present. It shapes perception. It influences position. And the sudden recentering of Diana's influence, especially in a form that had been hidden and is now being revealed, inevitably raised questions about space, about recognition, about where authority truly resides. Various interpretations suggest that this moment introduced a perceived threat, not in overt terms, but in the quiet recalibration of attention. Because attention, within royal dynamics, is never neutral. It moves carefully, deliberately, and when it shifts, it carries meaning. The renewed focus on Diana's legacy, particularly during a time when the monarchy itself is navigating uncertainty, created an undercurrent that could not be ignored. It was not about replacing one narrative with another, but about the coexistence of two powerful legacies, one established through presence, the other through absence, and the tension that naturally arises between them. And as that tension began to take shape, it extended beyond emotion into something more structural. Palace dynamics, according to those familiar with the internal atmosphere, began to subtly adjust. Conversations became more measured, alignments less certain. There was no dramatic confrontation, no visible conflict, but the shifts were there in the way certain topics were approached, in the way decisions were delayed, in the careful language used to navigate discussions that suddenly felt more sensitive than before, because the implications of the vault were still unfolding, and with each new layer of understanding, the sense of unpredictability grew. That unpredictability is what made the situation particularly delicate, because it introduced variables that could not be fully controlled, and in an environment built on control, that alone is enough to create unease. Speculation of behind-the-scenes discussions began to circulate, not confirmed, not publicly acknowledged, but persistent enough to suggest that internal disagreements may have emerged. Not necessarily about the facts, but about the response, about how to manage the narrative, about how to interpret the significance of what had been discovered. Because interpretation, in this context, is everything. It determines not just what is said, but what is implied, what is emphasized, what is allowed to remain unspoken. And as these interpretations diverged, the atmosphere became more complex, not fractured, but layered, with each layer carrying its own perspective, its own priorities, its own understanding of what was at stake. And at the center of it all was a growing recognition that this was not a temporary moment. It was a turning point, one that would require careful navigation not just in terms of public perception, but within the internal structure of the monarchy itself. Because once a legacy reasserts itself in this way, it does not simply fade back into the background. It remains. It influences. It shapes decisions in ways that may not be immediately visible but are deeply felt. And that is where the real tension lies, not in what is known, but in what is still unfolding. In the anticipation of what might come next. In the awareness that the balance, once steady, is now in motion. And in that motion there is both risk and revelation. Because every shift creates an opening, every uncertainty invites action, and every moment of silence carries within it the possibility of change. But this wasn't just about emotion, it was about control, and next move would determine who truly held it. Behind palace walls, the real battle wasn't fought with words but with documents, authority, and timing. What had begun as a discovery was now evolving into something far more calculated, far more deliberate. Because once the existence of the vault could no longer be contained, the focus shifted immediately to control who had it, who could claim it, and most importantly, who could define what it meant. Reports suggest that King Charles III's legal team moved swiftly, not publicly, but with precision, initiating a layered analysis of ownership rights and implications that extended far beyond the vault itself. This was no longer about curiosity or historical interest. It was about structure, about jurisdiction, about the invisible lines that separate personal inheritance from institutional authority. And those lines, as it turned out, were anything but clear. Because the vault existed in a space that defied easy classification. It was tied to Diana, Princess of Wales's personal estate, yet its significance could not be separated from the monarchy she had once been part of. That duality created a legal tension that could not be ignored. Some interpretations suggest that its contents fall strictly under private inheritance laws, meaning their distribution would follow personal directives, potentially placing control in the hands of her sons. Others argue that the symbolic weight of those contents, given Diana's position, enduring influence, places them within the broader scope of crown oversight, where decisions are guided not just by law, but by legacy. And it is within that ambiguity that the real conflict begins to take shape. Because ambiguity invites interpretation, and interpretation invites strategy. Insiders whisper that multiple legal perspectives were being considered simultaneously, each one carefully evaluated not just for its validity, but for its consequences. Because every possible outcome carried risk. Not just legal risk, but reputational, emotional, and structural risk. And as those considerations deepened, the involvement of Prince William, Prince of Wales, and Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, became increasingly difficult to avoid. Their connection to Diana is not just personal, it is central. which means that any decision regarding the vault's contents inevitably intersects with their position, their rights, and their relationship with the institution itself. Reports suggest that this added another layer of complexity to an already delicate situation, because involving them directly could bring clarity, but it could also bring exposure. And exposure in this context is something the palace appears determined to manage with extreme caution. That caution has manifested in a strategic delay, not a pause born of uncertainty, but one rooted in control. By limiting the flow of information, by carefully sequencing what is revealed and when, the palace maintains a degree of influence over the narrative. It allows time for alignment, for preparation, for the quiet negotiation of positions that may never be publicly acknowledged but are nonetheless critical. Because timing, in moments like this, is everything. Release information too early, and you risk losing control. Wait too long, and speculation begins to fill the void. And speculation, once it takes hold, is difficult to contain. That is why the current approach appears so measured, so deliberate. Every step calculated. Every decision weighed not just for its immediate impact, but for how it shapes the broader arc of the situation. And as this process continues behind closed doors, a growing realization begins to take hold. This is not just a legal matter, it is a turning point. Because the outcome of this analysis, whatever it may be, has the potential to reshape internal power dynamics in ways that extend far beyond the vault itself. It touches on questions of authority, of legacy, of who ultimately defines narrative of the monarchy moving forward. And those questions do not exist in isolation. They connect to existing tensions, to unspoken divisions, to the evolving roles of those within the royal structure. That is why the stakes feel so high. Because this is not just about resolving a discovery. It is about managing its consequences. And those consequences are still unfolding, quietly, steadily, with each new layer of understanding adding pressure to a system already under strain. There is no clear resolution yet, no definitive path forward, only a series of calculated moves, each one designed to maintain balance while navigating uncertainty. But balance, in situations like this, is never static. It shifts, it adapts, and sometimes it breaks. And just when it seemed the situation might stabilize, one final revelation changed everything. It wasn't the existence of the vault that shocked the palace, it was what it revealed. Because once the first layers were carefully examined, the initial legal caution gave way to controlled access. The narrative shifted from speculation to consequence. Reports suggest that among the contents were items not merely preserved for memory, but positioned with intent documents, personal effects, and symbolic inheritances that seem to reach beyond the past and into decisions yet to be made. And that is where the unease deepened. Because this was no longer about what had been left behind. It was about what had been left forward. Insiders whisper that certain materials within the vault may be directly tied to future royal considerations, not in explicit commands, but in carefully framed messages guidance that carries emotional authority rather than legal force. And in a system where perception often shapes reality, that kind of influence can be just as powerful. The possibility of handwritten reflections, private instructions, or symbolic gestures directed toward Prince William, Prince of Wales, and Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, introduces a dynamic that cannot be easily managed. Because it places Diana's voice quiet, preserved, but undeniably present into conversations that were never meant to include it. And that presence, even if indirect, changes the tone. It shifts the weight of decisions. It introduces a layer of emotional gravity that cannot be ignored. Various interpretations suggest that this is where the true impact lies, not in the physical value of what was discovered, but in the meaning it carries. Because meaning influences direction. It shapes narrative. It defines how actions are understood, both within the palace and beyond it. And as those meanings begin to circulate, even in controlled environments, they begin to resonate outward. The public, already attuned to the enduring legacy of Diana, Princess of Wales, responds not just to facts, but to implications. And the implications here are profound, because they suggest that Diana's influence did not end, it evolved. It adapted. It found a way to remain relevant in a system that had long attempted to move forward without reopening old chapters. That realization alone has been enough to reignite public interest. Media speculation, once cautious, begins to intensify. Questions emerge. Not all of them answerable, not all of them grounded in confirmed detail, but persistent enough to create pressure. Pressure on the palace to respond, to clarify, to manage a narrative that is rapidly expanding beyond its control. And that is where the challenge becomes most visible. Because preparing for narrative fallout is not just about issuing statements or controlling access. It is about anticipating how each piece of information will be interpreted, how it will be received, how it will interact with existing perceptions. And in this case, those perceptions are deeply rooted. They are emotional. They are complex. They cannot be easily redirected. That is why the palace response appears so measured, so deliberate. Not because the situation is stable, but because it is volatile. Every move must be calculated. Every decision weighed against potential consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. Because this is not just a story unfolding, it is a reckoning. A confrontation between past and present. Between what was preserved and what is now being revealed. And within that confrontation lies a deeper question. Not just about legacy, but about identity. About how the monarchy defines itself in relation to its own history. About what it chooses to acknowledge and what it has long chosen to leave unspoken. Because the vault, in all its silence, has begun to speak. Not loudly, not directly, but with enough clarity to disrupt the balance that once held everything in place. And as that disruption continues to unfold, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain the boundaries that once kept certain narratives contained. Because once something hidden begins to surface, it brings with it everything that was. Buried alongside it questions, emotions, unresolved tensions. And those elements do not remain isolated. They connect. They build. They create momentum. Momentum that is now moving through the palace, through the public, through the very structure of how the monarchy is perceived. And that movement cannot be easily slowed. It cannot be redirected without consequence. It demands engagement. It demands response. And perhaps most of all, it demands recognition. Recognition that this moment is not just about a discovery. It is about what that discovery represents. About what it reveals, not just in terms of content, but in terms of truth. Because beneath the legal analysis, beneath the strategic delay, beneath the careful management of information, there is something more fundamental at play. Something that cannot be contained within documents or defined by authority. And that is the enduring power of legacy. A legacy that continues to influence, to challenge, to reshape the narrative long after it was thought to be settled. But the deeper truth wasn't just about what Diana left behind, it was about what the monarchy could no longer hide. In a system built on control, even a silent legacy can rewrite the rules, and that shift was already underway. What had begun as a contained discovery was now unfolding into something far more expansive, reaching beyond the walls of the palace and into the broader landscape of public perception. Because the moment Diana's legacy re-entered the conversation not as nostalgia, but as influence, it began to reshape the narrative in ways that could not be easily managed. Reports suggest that the public response, though subtle at first, carried a familiar intensity. It was not driven by new information alone, but by the emotional resonance that Diana, Princess of Wales, has always held. That resonance does not fade with time. It evolves. It adapts. And in moments like this, it reasserts itself with quiet force. The idea that her voice, her intentions, her presence could still carry weight within the monarchy has begun to shift how people interpret everything else. Every decision, every gesture, every silence. And within that shift, one figure inevitably moves closer to the center: Prince William, Prince of Wales. Because as Diana's legacy resurfaces, so too does the symbolic connection he represents. Not just as her son, but as the continuation of what she stood for. Various interpretations suggest that this moment has strengthened his position not through formal declaration, but through perception. And perception, in the context of the monarchy, is a form of power. It shapes expectations. It influences alignment. It creates momentum that can redefine roles without a single official change. And as that momentum builds, it begins to ripple through the internal structure of the palace itself. There is a sense, according to those familiar with the dynamics, that a recalibration is quietly taking place. Not announced, formalized, but understood. A reassessment of influence, of positioning, of how each figure fits into a narrative that is no longer entirely predictable. Because the resurgence of Diana's legacy introduces a variable that cannot be controlled in the usual ways. It is not governed by protocol. It does not respond to strategy in the same way other elements do. It exists outside the system, and yet it affects everything within it. And that creates a kind of tension that is both subtle and significant. Particularly for Queen Camilla, whose role, while firmly established, now finds itself under renewed scrutiny. Not through direct challenge, but through comparison, through contrast, through the quiet reemergence of a legacy that carries a different kind of connection with the public. Reports suggest that this scrutiny is not overt, but it is present. It can be felt in the way narratives are framed, in the way attention shifts, in the way certain moments are interpreted. Because when two legacies exist side by side, one current, one returning, the balance between them becomes delicate, and that balance is now being tested. At the same time, there are indications that royal messaging has begun to adjust. Not dramatically, not in ways that would draw immediate attention, but in tone, in emphasis, in the subtle positioning of words and appearances that reflect an awareness of the changing narrative. Because the monarchy, at its core, is adaptive. It responds to shifts even, when those shifts originate from unexpected places. And this resurgence of Diana's influence is certainly unexpected. It introduces complexity. It challenges assumptions. It requires a response that is both careful and calculated. But adaptation does not mean resolution. It means movement. It means navigating a landscape that is still evolving, still uncertain, still carrying the weight of what has yet to be fully understood. Because while the immediate reaction may be measured, long-term implications remain unclear. And that uncertainty is what keeps the tension alive. Because every adjustment, every recalibration, every subtle shift in positioning is part of a larger process, one that is still unfolding, one that is still defining itself. And as that process continues, the monarchy finds itself in a position it has not faced in quite this way before, balancing not just tradition and modernity, but presence and memory, authority and emotion, control and legacy. Within that balance lies the real challenge. Not just managing what is visible, but understanding what is shaping it from beneath. Because the narrative is no longer singular. It is layered. It is influenced by forces that do not follow the usual patterns. And that makes it harder to predict, harder to contain, harder to resolve. Which is why, even as the dust begins to settle, there is no sense of finality, only a pause, a moment of stillness before the next development. Because the story is not over. It is evolving. And with each new layer, it moves closer to a question that cannot be avoided. And as the dust began to settle, one question remained: what does this mean for the future of the crown? Some legacies fade with time, but others wait, buried in silence, until the moment they can no longer be ignored. And what has unfolded through the quiet unsealing of that vault is not simply a rediscovery, but a reminder, one that reaches far beyond documents and possessions, into the very identity of the monarchy itself. Because the enduring influence of Diana, Princess of Wales, was never confined to her lifetime. It lives in memory, in perception, in the emotional connection she forged with the public, and now, more than ever, in the quiet but undeniable force of what she chose to leave behind. The vault, once hidden and untouched, has become more than a physical space. It has transformed into a symbol of unfinished history, of questions left unanswered, of a narrative that was never fully closed. And symbols within the monarchy carry weight that cannot be measured in simple terms. They shape understanding. They influence direction. They define how the past continues to interact with the present. That is why the emotional and political impact of this moment extends far beyond those directly involved. It reaches into the next generation, into the evolving roles of figures like Prince William, Prince of Wales, whose connection to Diana is not just personal but deeply symbolic. It touches on the complexities surrounding Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, whose relationship with the institution has already introduced layers of tension and transformation. And at the center of it all stands King Charles III, navigating a path that is as personal as it is institutional. Because this is not just a matter of governance or protocol for him, it is a confrontation with legacy, with memory, with decisions made in the past that now return with new meaning. Reports suggest that this moment has placed him in a position of quiet conflict, balancing duty with reflection, responsibility with emotion. Because the monarchy demands continuity, but legacy demands acknowledgement. And finding a way to hold both without compromising either is no simple task. It requires careful thought, measured response, and an understanding that some questions cannot be answered through structure alone. They require something deeper, something more human. And that is where the true challenge lies. Because the monarchy now faces a crossroads, not one defined by public crisis or visible disruption, but by something far more complex. A choice between maintaining the comfort of established narratives or engaging with the truth that those narratives may no longer fully contain. A choice between preserving tradition as it has always been understood, or allowing space for a legacy that exists beyond those boundaries. And that choice, while subtle, carries profound implications, because it shapes not just how the monarchy is seen, but how it sees itself, how it understands its past, how it defines its future. And as this moment continues to unfold, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The past is not something that can be neatly set aside. It does not remain fixed in time. It moves. It evolves. It waits. And when the moment comes, it returns not to disrupt, but to be acknowledged, to be understood, to be integrated into a story that is still being written. That is the true power of legacy. Not its ability to remain unchanged, but its ability to endure, to adapt, to influence long after the moment that created it is past. And in this case, that influence is unmistakable. It is present in the questions being asked, in the decisions being considered, in the quiet recalibrations taking place behind closed doors. It is shaping the narrative in ways that are both visible and unseen. And it is reminding everyone involved that history is never truly silent. It speaks even when it is hidden. It guides even when it is not acknowledged. And sometimes it waits patiently, deliberately, until the moment it can no longer be ignored. Because in the end, this was never just about a vault, it was about a legacy powerful enough to reshape everything that came after. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.